Okay, today we're going to talk about the Synoptic Gospels. I'm not an expert on this at all. I'm at all. But when I taught for the University of Maryland for many years, I was able to teach, I'd say, 5 or 6 times, 6 times anyway, a course called the New Testament. 5 times maybe a course called the Old Testament. So, and I tried to study hard for those things because what an opportunity to become not an expert at all, but conversant with these things was a great opportunity for me. I relied heavily on a textbook that I found called Anatomy of the New Testament. I suspect that it's still very good, but I don't know. I'm sure there are other textbooks. D. Moody Smith was one of the authors. He was at Duke. I know. Maybe he still is. I don't know. Then also I relied on the Interpreter's Bible in 2 volumes. Great, I think, high level, I think, but probably out of date then, maybe even then. Now, I don't know. Another book that I thought was excellent in spots, at least, was Mackenzie's Dictionary of the Bible, I think it's called. Mackenzie was a Jesuit scholar. And I also used Bible Handbook, for example, the Abingdon Bible Handbook, and what I hoped to gain by doing that, also Harper's sometimes, what I hoped to gain, and what I must have gained partly, at least, was a sense of trying to gain a kind of synthesis of Catholic scholarship, Protestant scholarship, conservative Protestant, because Abingdon is published in Nashville, heart of the Bible Belt. So I assumed that I was getting some kind of synthesis or overview of scholarship. And the Interpreter's Bible, some Catholic, some Protestant, some Jewish, for Old Testament, of course. Trying to gain an overview. What I found, for my purposes at least, was a remarkable harmony among these. They disagree sometimes, but mostly, I thought, they agreed. And I thought that was interesting. The conservative Bible Belt scholars tried to be objective. For example, in a question like the authorship, the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Bible, of the Old Testament. They at least presented the other point of view, but presented then the single author Mosaic scholarship, admitted that those who defended it were outnumbered far by others. Good enough, fair enough. The other didn't present the Mosaic view, or if it did, it dismissed it quickly, but for my purposes, as I say, that was close enough. Okay, here we go. The Synoptic Gospels. The Synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, Luke, the first 3 books of the New Testament. The New Testament has 27 books. The Old Testament, 39. Total 66. In the New Testament, the first 4 books are called Gospels, and the first 3 synoptic, because they see together or agree to a fairly large extent on chronology and what happened in the life of Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ. Okay, but of course there are limitations to this synoptic sense. seeing together. Now, the theory that I suppose must still be dominant of the Synoptic Gospels runs like this. The oldest must have been Mark. And Mark was composed, it seems, around 65, between 65 and 70 CE, Christian era. Why? Because between 65 and 70, persecution, especially through 68, when Nero died, persecution of the Christians in Rome. They were never persecuted everywhere, but persecution was sporadic, now here, now there. But in Rome, under Nero, persecution was pretty bad. After all, by tradition, in 65, Peter and Paul were martyred in 65 in Rome. 70 is the limit because in 70, Titus, the son of Diocletian, the emperor, took and destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. Well, one of Christ's predictions in Mark, as in Matthew and Luke, was that the temple would be destroyed. Well, one might sense some difficulty here, because a skeptic might very well suspect that at least that prediction was made after 70. I'll tell you right now, people basically, I want to remember to explain what a gospel is in the first place. Maybe I better explain that now. Gospel is from the English Godspell. Godspell means good story or good news. Godspell derives from Greek euangelion and Latin evangelium, real close, evangelist, and these words have gone through a series of meanings. Very interesting. So Godspell to evangelium. Okay. First it meant the reward that the bringer of good news received. Now we just talked about this phenomenon in the Odyssey, which we just finished yesterday. These people who constantly brought the good news to Penelope and Telemachus that their father would soon be home, and expected an euangelion. And of course, the messages were lies. So this, of course, was a common phenomenon. Okay, first then it was the reward. Then it was the good news itself, which Jesus taught. Because, if anything, that's what it is. By the way, this good news is at the heart of the Gospels themselves, and should be called Gospels, good news. I'll get to that in a minute. Then it became, let's see now, just the fact that Jesus was born, the fact that Jesus existed was good news. Then it became the books about the good news, proclaiming the good news, which is what it is primarily now. Okay, now, what are Gospels then? They are not history. They are not biography. They don't pretend to be either one. They are religious proclamation based on historical events. Or, I think more cautiously, they are religious proclamations based on what are taken to be, what are presented as historical events. And frankly, I think that goes too far. That goes too far. I'm not sure that it pretends. The biblical scholars of the 20th century, among the greatest ever, because, as I've said many times, the glory of the 20th century was its scholarship. What else? the glory of the 20th century was its scholarship, and then the technology, of course, of the age of information. Okay. Historical criticism goes way back to the 18th century. Is, in fact, what's a good word? There's a good word, but anyway, it extends exactly during the period of history. The writing of history, in the Western sense of the word, begins in about 1750. Before that, history was written. Of course, Herodotus, Thucydides of the Greeks, Livy, Sallust of the Romans, others, Tacit. But their sense of history was slightly different from the modern sense. I won't get into that. But during the same period, of course, we have the historical approach to especially the Bible and the New Testament. Okay, the giants of the 20th century, Bultmann was one that I know a little bit, determined basically that when you try to distinguish legend, myth, from historical fact, what did Jesus say in this situation? What happened in this alleged miracle? What happened even in this alleged historical moment? It's impossible to find fact. It's impossible to find fact. It's impossible to say this at least was a fact. Because the whole thing is wrapped in religious proclamation, if you like. Now, one can philosophize about this, and a person like me does often. One can't find fact anywhere. All we have really are myths when you ultimately look at it from a skeptical point of view. I won't go into that now. So, I mean, in a way, Bultmann and the others, while demythologizing, were basically remythologizing, and in terms that are typical of the 20th century. 20th century historicism, historical view of things, is simply the scientific view turned on the matter of religion and history. Bultmann is famous for having coined, I guess, maybe no one had used it before, the word demythologizing. And the title of one of his short books, which I did read and which had a huge influence on me, but I think on everybody, is demythologizing Christianity, or demythologizing something. It's a short book, very readable, popular. This is popular scholarship, not for the scholars, but they already knew everything he said. So I was glad to find and read that book. His conclusion then, once again, now, of course, he is a careful man and an excellent scholar and important theologian. And what he wanted to get at was that, okay, just by saying that something is myth, and this is one of my main points in my work, just by saying that something is myth does not necessarily mean that it's a lie. In popular language, oh, that's a myth means that's a lie, a fabrication. So we're getting to some pretty heavy stuff here. The believer need not feel too attacked by these words. If a believer is overly fond of historical fact, if the believer wants basically scientific support for his beliefs, then he better abandon his beliefs. It's not going to happen. There's not scientific support for anything, frankly, ultimately. And it's so contrary to the spirit of what religion is, which is faith, especially Protestant, but Catholic faith, Jewish too. We're saved by faith, at least partly, if not entirely. to approach this matter in the spirit of it is scientific fact, it is historical fact that Jesus did this or said that, it seems to me is totally wrong-headed, is even blasphemy. Blasphemous, sacrilege, contrary to what religion should be. Faith and love save us, not scientific fact. I would say that's what Christianity is about. Other religions too. So this determination to find historical fact in the New Testament is folly, is total folly, and it's wrong-headed, and it's even, I think, blasphemous. Blasphemy, a sin. Okay, sorry. The Synoptics. I'm not going to linger on these background things because we'll run out of time. Okay. Mark, 65 to 70, maybe. Then, demonstrably, Matthew and Luke both followed Mark. They followed mainly his chronology. Some passages are literally almost the same, but they also followed something else. That is usually called Q, for Quelle. Quelle is a German word. The Germans dominated, especially in the 19th century, but still in the 20th century, German Americans. Quelle means source. Quelle is a posited, that is, theoretically it existed, a collection of Jesus' sayings. Excuse me. Excuse me. I'll turn that off. Excuse me. Collection of Jesus' sayings. Both Matthew and Luke had access to this supposed document, or something like that. And they also had access to special Matthew, and special Lucan material. This is the theory of the Synoptic Gospels, and as far as I know, it's still widely accepted, but the scholars are always finding objections to things, so within these limitations, I guess. Okay, so first we should discuss Mark, then we'll discuss Matthew, then we'll discuss Luke, and I'll try to tell you what's distinctively, what distinguishes them one from another, and what at least strikes me as important. First of all, let's notice that the biggest thing that unites the three, other than Mark's basis, is the view of the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven. This is the good news, really. The kingdom is referred to as is dominant in Matthew. I'll tell you right now because I remember the numbers. The kingdom is referred to 54 times in Matthew. 54 times. 41 times in Luke. Only 19 times in Mark. That's a total of something like 119 or something. But it's referred to only 34 times outside these three, including John. So, numerically, it is just insisted upon. The kingdom is the proclamation that best summarizes the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus' announcement of the kingdom of God. There are slightly different interpretations of what the kingdom really meant, especially Matthew's distinctive one, Luke's slightly different, Mark's a little more primitive, let's say. Now let's notice that this idea, of course, differs in these three books. Now, right from the start, we have to appreciate something. Teaching the Bible as literature, I said I taught courses on New Testament, Old Testament. These courses were called the Bible as literature. And I teach it in my high school classes in AP, English. I teach Old Testament, New Testament freely. I have never had a problem with anyone, even in our relatively conservative military community, which I have been a member of for a long time, before peripherally on the outskirts, now much more directly as a high school teacher. No one has ever questioned or complained or protested against this. I think that's wonderful. That's pretty great on their part. People want to know and should know, whatever their religion in the Western world, should know about the Old and New Testament. Their opinions of or their degree of belief in it is their own personal matter, of course, and that's how I teach it. Okay. Mark. What I wanted to say from the outset was that these three works are works really of literature. And when I tell you about Mark, you'll see what I mean right away. These authors had distinct points of view, specific points of view. They had certain ideas which they espoused and advocated, and which they made sure that material yielded. So they are like any other author, like me, myself, and my material. They are manipulating, altering, making the data, if you like, or the raw material fit their perspective, because they have definite ideas, favorite ideas that they are projecting in these works. And these ideas are different. These points of view are certainly different. You'll see this right away in Mark. Okay, I better get to that. In Mark 8, chapters 22 to 26, we have a wonderful thing which continues then in 9. Now, well known in all three of the Gospels is this, and in the Old Testament too, is this pattern of doubling. I don't have exact passages here. It doesn't concern me, but find it if you will. Something like 640 to 720 is doubled by 8:1 to 8:30. Again, I'll find the exact passages if anybody cares, but I'm not going to be held to that exactitude. I don't have any notes here. I like to do this from memory if I can, but I can't remember that. The pattern, it goes something like this. There's a water miracle, then there's a healing, then there's a discussion, and there's a fourth element. And then the same pattern is repeated in the later passage. Is this chance? No, it's not chance. This is the author at work. Now I'm going to tell you about the most striking instance of this that has had a huge effect on me, because it made me realize these guys are authors. Pretty good authors in this instance, because I certainly didn't see this. Here's what happens. In 8:22 to 8:26, we have the healing of the blind man of Bethsaida, up in the north, northern Palestine. Jesus, someone says, please, Master, heal the blind man. So Jesus takes him away from the crowd, and this is one of these things where apparently he's alone. The Gospels are full of this. Jesus is alone, but the authors supply us with what Jesus said. The most striking instance of this, by the way, I better say it now, in his prayer at Gethsemane, in the garden there before he was betrayed, when he will be betrayed, he was alone, and his followers even fell asleep. And yet were reported what he said to Abba, Father, when he asked, for example, not to have to be forced to drink this cup of suffering. Well, of course, then certainly Mark and Matthew and Luke were not there. Nobody was there. You see what I mean? If you take this as historical fact, then you are absurd. This is an author supplying words, as historians, ancient historians, were very fond of doing. Acts is full of this. Okay, back to my story. So Jesus takes the man outside of town, and I think he spits in his hand, in his own hand, maybe even uses some dirt, I don't know, applies to the eyes. And Jesus says, "Can you see?" And the man says remarkably, "I see men walking as trees." Then Jesus reapplies a second time, and the man is healed. This is the only two-stage healing in the New Testament. And then Jesus, in almost immediately thereafter, Jesus is in Caesarea Philippi. I remember that's a little important, way in the north. And Jesus is talking with his disciples, and he says, "Whom do men say I am?" Now, who do men say I am? And some say Elijah, the prophet. Some say John the Baptist, who is already dead. Who do you say I am? Two stages again. And then Peter says, his great confession, "Thou art the Christ." You are the Christ. And Matthew follows this exactly, but adds words to it. But we're on Mark. This is a glorious moment in the gospel, in Mark. And if it's historical, it's a glorious moment in history, really, no matter who Jesus was. Because it's a moment of inspired insight. And that inspiration is granted to Peter. But you are Peter the rock. That's when he gets his name, and on this rock I shall found my church. But then they start walking toward Jerusalem, and Jesus teaches them tells them what he has to do in Jerusalem, and what he has to do is suffer, be whipped and mistreated terribly, and finally be crucified. But then he will rise from the dead. Then Peter, the same Peter, rebukes Jesus. I love to tell this story. No, Jesus, you've got it all wrong. But wait a minute, Peter. This is so human, isn't it? Peter just announced, "Thou art the Christ." If he's the Christ, how could he have it all wrong? Excuse me. He's the Messiah. He's the anointed one. He is, in a certain sense, more than God's messenger, because the Messiah was much more than that. He was divine. How could he have it all wrong? Okay, come on, Peter. It just shows so perfectly our human limitations, our stupidity, our silliness, inescapable. And that's okay. I mean, we are. I am. God. Okay. And then, "Get thee behind me, Satan. You talk like a man, not like a believer." And he teaches them. And don't lose my point here. Two stages of the healing, two stages of discipleship. The first stage Peter was at. He could see. He had a moment of inspired insight, even if you like, of faith. But the second step will be necessary, and that is suffering. And suffering is the big message of Mark. Suffering is the message of Mark. By the way, 2 points I want to make here. First of all, when Moody Smith and his colleague point out this pattern, it pointed out that, and when I read that, I realized, wait a minute, these guys are authors. These authors are doing what authors do, what a novelist will do with this doubling pattern. Is that historical? No, it's not historical. Of course, it's not historical. Or even if the two events were historical, they wouldn't. Lots of other things happened in between, right? But the author is being an author. This is what creativity. This is what creative people are supposed to do. Structure, and through structure, meaning. He's manipulating the material so that it yields the message that he wants it to yield. Great scholarship, excellent authorship. Mark was no fool. He was a good author. Good authors do things like that. I missed it. But my second point is this. Suffering. I love Mark, and I prefer Mark to the other Gospels for one reason. It's typical of me, maybe. Mark depicts the disciples as silly, quarrelsome, vain, incapable of any depth of faith. For Mark, when Peter denies Christ 3 times, that is just so quintessentially human. Mark has no qualms about presenting the disciples as contemptible, really, and yet these will become the men of faith, but only through suffering. Suffering makes us a whole lot less silly. Only suffering can make us not silly. I think I believe that. I think any serious student of oneself even, I'm kind of a silly person myself. I sure haven't suffered much. Not kind of, I am. I know I am. I'm trying to be serious, but only suffering makes us serious human beings. I believe that. And I think most people must believe that. And it's certainly at the core of Mark's message. So he doesn't hesitate to present the disciples as silly, vain. When you come in your glory, who will sit on your right and who will sit on your left? They eagerly were discussing and debating among themselves. And then they came to the master, and the master said, "Oh my God, how long must I endure you swine? How long must I endure you silly creatures?" And he says this in a somewhat ungentle, unforgiving, petulant, irritable way. Another favorite point that I focus on, this is true of Mark and the others. By the way, Matthew and Luke both soften this view of the disciples. Both are much kindlier, much gentler to the disciples, make them much better, and soften the harsh view that Mark gives. But that's why I like Mark. Matthew and Luke have their strengths, but you choose. But and Mark has his reasons for presenting them like this. His view is we must suffer. His message, the reason why the date 65 is usually given, is that the Christians were suffering, and Mark's gospel is directed to people who are suffering. And his message is we must suffer to become disciples, to become real believers. And really, you don't have to, you can divorce it from that material and say to become real people. And I believe that in the abstract, and try to believe it as much as I can. Okay, so, remarkable. Now, Matthew. Matthew was probably written 25 years later, or 15 years later, let's say, around 80, somewhere between 80 and 100. And scholars debate about this. Who was Matthew? Matthew was a Jewish Christian. He knew the Old Testament. There are many more references to the Old Testament literature, many more references to geography of Palestine. He knows Palestine. He knows Judaism. And his message is to Jewish Christians. Matthew presents Jesus as rabbi. He is the teacher. Much more than a miracle worker. In the miracles he follows Mark, but then he expands it vastly with teachings. He's a teacher. He's a rabbi. Jesus is a rabbi teacher. The classic place of this is the Sermon on the Mount, which is in Matthew, chapters 5 through 7. Here's the teacher just teaching, wow. Of course, the situation is from Mark, but Matthew crams a whole bunch of other material into the one place to concentrate it. There Jesus is the supreme ethical teacher. But you've got to have some problems with this. Now, talk about the Sermon on the Mount then, especially. here at the heart of it are three things, I would say. We get the 5 Beatitudes. No, not 5, 8, 10 Beatitudes, let's say. We get the 7, I don't remember numbers very well, the 7 antitheses. I'll explain. And we get the, oh God, that's another, I'm forgetting a third one, but I'm just doing my best here. The Beatitudes. Blessed are those who, what he emphasizes especially are the simple, the meek and humble, the trusting, the poor. The poor are blessed in themselves, and Luke goes wild over this. In my opinion, Luke is very romantic, but Matthew. Now, the antitheses are very interesting. How many? 7, I think. I could check quickly. Maybe I will in a minute, because I want to get that third thing. The antitheses go something like this. Ye have heard, you have heard, the rabbis have taught you that this, and this are true. But I tell you, go beyond that. To this point you must go. Far beyond. Maybe. Okay, we have the 9 Beatitudes, the 6 antitheses, and the Lord's Prayer. I had forgotten the Lord's Prayer. I couldn't think of that. All this in the Sermon on the Mount, and much more, really. Now, I'm talking about the antitheses. You have heard this, but I tell you this. The term that emerges from this is the higher righteousness. The higher righteousness. And this would become very important for Paul, St. Paul. Now, this higher righteousness, I have some problems with this, and I'm sure any thinking person does. Higher righteousness, my God, we're seldom capable of very low righteousness. This is so, of course, Jesus knows that he is asking us to live on, or at least achieve some time in our lives, something so extraordinarily high. Something that, strictly speaking, he himself does not achieve. So let me focus on this favorite point of mine. Jesus is depicted in all 4 Gospels as being extremely, ranging, I would say, from irritable to furious at the Scribes and Pharisees. Scribes and Pharisees. Pharisees and Scribes. He explodes in wrath and rage at them in a very un-Christ-like way. He is relentless toward them. One could almost think that he hates them. Excuse me? This is interesting. Now, this is in all 4 of the Gospels. And I think this point does not get enough attention. Now, this is a favorite point of mine in my work, and I'm going to focus on it for a couple of minutes. Who are the Scribes and Pharisees? They are the defenders of orthodoxy. They are the defenders of the Jewish religion. And as I like to say, somewhat sarcastically, they might say, if we don't defend the faith, if we don't defend the flock, who will? From false teachers, false prophets. And that's what they should do. That's what they should do. And that's what church leaders should do. And Jesus hates them. I'll exaggerate a little bit just for simplicity. Jesus hates them. Now, of all the messages that get passed down, this certainly is neglected. Okay, everybody knows the poor are blessed. Yeah, we say. So I'm supposed to be poor? Come on. This is romantic nonsense, as all good middle class and upper middle class, as all wealthy Christians know, this is romantic nonsense. Okay. From that point of view, the ethical teachings of Jesus are romantic nonsense. They are nonsense. You have heard that it is bad to commit adultery, but I tell you, if you look at a woman to lust after her, you have already committed adultery in your heart. Sorry, romantic nonsense. Sorry, Jesus. in this world there is no such thing as a person who is capable, even briefly, of such standards. If on that, living in a monastery, not much maybe, then the others, the other facts, I dare say, of human behavior. The standard is way too high, and as too high, I personally almost dismiss it. It's romantic nonsense. No, and Jesus himself does not quite achieve it. Meek and humble, meek, the meek part. Where's the meek part? Toward the scribes and Pharisees, toward the orthodox heads of the Jewish religion. But let's apply this to where it must be applied, because obviously it must be applied. What is Jesus' attitude toward the Vatican then? Because the Vatican are the scribes and Pharisees. What is Jesus' attitude toward the bishops and the archbishops and the heads and the elders and all of them of every church? It has to be the same. It has to be. There is no way that it can't be the same. Wow. Let's get serious here. If you are going to apply the Bible where it most obviously is applicable, there it is. Jesus would have, the Jesus of the Gospels is incapable of having any patience with the heads of religion. How could it be otherwise? That's what we see. And, much more important, Jesus does not apply his own beatitude, at least, of meekness and patient suffering to himself in his attitude toward the scribes and Pharisees. It's relentless. It's over and over and over again. He never relents on it. Most unchristlike. The meek lamb, Jesus the meek lamb, come on. Now, another very important point. This has been my point, and maybe others have developed this point too. But at what point does Jesus himself in the Gospels become aware that he is the Messiah? Because it's pretty clear that he was not aware that he was the Messiah before. And for some famous scholars, that moment is Peter's confession. At that point only does he become the Messiah, at least consciously the Messiah. Of course, we've got the huge problem of Jesus, Son of God. The whole term Son, Son of God, Son of Man, this loaded with Semitic implications, apocalyptic expectations and all that. Boy, I've got a lot to say on this. I'm going to run out of time, I see. I didn't. For many theologians, I know that John Hick says this, and Bultmann, I guess, says this. Jesus became the Messiah, consciously at least, with Peter's confession. And from there he becomes the suffering servant of Deutero-Isaiah, Isaiah chapters 40 to 55, Deutero-Isaiah as he's called, because he is clearly different from the author of the first 40 chapters, and the final 14 chapters are Trito-Isaiah. But now I'm wandering. Back to our main point here. A central idea here is, of course, and what does one do with this? What does one mean by Son of God? In what sense? In my own opinion, it's absurd. I'm sorry, it's absurd. In no sense, unless we are all sons of God, in no sense is this comprehensible, at least. The believer is forced into a very strange, bizarre situation. Most believers are timid believers in, okay, I admit I don't understand the incarnation. I admit I don't understand the dual nature, the pre-existent Christ of John, the fourth gospel, existing from all eternity. I admit that I do not understand what is in the Apostles' Creed, which is pretty basic. Frankly, any believer who says he believes it is, in my opinion, talking nonsense. It is incomprehensible. It is rationally indefensible. Now, the believer is forced to abandon rationality. And that's okay. We're saved by faith. But I think the believer must admit, and must confess, and should confess, and frankly should confess exultantly, joyfully. But that's going a little too far for our human nature, I think. No, we can't abandon rationality. Rationality limits and structures our lives, irrational or semi-rational that we are, and mysterious that ultimately our whole lives are, and we ourselves are. But abandon rationality, that's asking a lot. And I'm not sure that we're even capable of doing so. I have to discuss sometime, maybe I'll discuss that tomorrow, that point. Who was this man, Jesus Christ? And we're forced into these absurd doctrines. The kenosis is a Greek word that Christians are forced to embrace. Kenosis means emptying. That is, Christ on the cross, was he the Son of God? Was he God? Was he the Logos hanging on that cross? Obviously not. We want to say that he was fully human at that time because he's suffering for us. And his sufferings must not be minimized. If we say he's the Logos, then we say he felt pain and he shares our pain. This is full of confusions. And so the doctrine of kenosis has evolved and is embraced by Christians who know about it anyway. That is, no, he emptied himself of his divine nature at that point. Well, this is absurd. The whole term Son of God, I'm sorry, is absurd. Is absolutely absurd. Virgin birth, totally absurd. Totally absurd. Insulting. Insulting to womanhood because it's based, it's based on a contemptuous view of woman, of sexuality, of the body. But here let's get to a big idea. Dualism. Dualism is a huge problem to us human beings. We are even Plato and other dualists. What is dualism? In very broad terms, dualism is the view that there is not one standard of truth, or there is not one world even, one universe, but really there are two. And usually, in extreme forms, dualism posits, I've discussed this before, in Candide, for example, Manichaeism, light and dark. Okay, but for most people, there's philosophical dualism too. That is, mind and physical reality. These are so different that it's impossible one must make a leap of faith to assume that they share the same world. That mind and perceptions, that is what in our mind we think we are perceiving, and reality are the same, I think, is indefensible. Kant is an attempt to get past that, and of course we never do get past that. That's philosophical dualism. Religious dualism is a little different. It posits the dichotomy of spirit and matter, spirit and flesh, soul and body. Religion has a hard time getting past this, in fact, cannot get past it. The two are different. And so Christians, all Christians are dualistic to some degree, that is, and the New Testament is largely an attempt to transcend or to get past the dualism of Gnosticism, Gnosticism. I'll discuss that sometime. But here's the point. Every Christian is really a Platonist, because Plato simply dealt with it better than anybody in Western or Eastern history. That is, we have our bodies, but we have our souls. And people believe, all over the world that something called soul will exist after the destruction, the death of body. Well, this is dualism, of course. And automatically, this supposes the superiority of spirit, soul, over flesh, matter. Spirit is eternal, flesh, temporal, transient, passes away. Body, trash. Soul, absolute, eternal, glorious. Now, Christianity and Judaism try to get past this. By the way, this is not Old Testament. Judaism is not like that. To its credit, to its immense credit, Judaism, through the Old Testament at least, preserved a kind of purity from Judaism does not emphasize an afterlife, does not emphasize a soul, does not emphasize at all any supposed superiority of soul to body or spirit to matter. Judaism is gloriously free of this. But Western men and even Jewish history is not free of this. Can't escape it. Okay. One way that Christianity has tried to get by this is the doctrine of the resurrection of the body. This fanciful, absurd notion, which Paul embraces, I think, maybe in 2 Corinthians, is an attempt to get past this Gnostic dualism, to try to attach some dignity, some even eternal dignity, to the body. It is a very strained notion. It's impossible to explain. My body when I was 16 or my body at 60. My body in sickness or health. My body obese or my body slender. And so forth. It's just too absurd for me. It's untenable. And I'm really talking myself into... every time, not every time, but in important lectures for Dr. Shin, my thinking always kind of evolves here as I have a chance to talk about these things openly and frankly, saying things going beyond what I would say in the classroom, because it would be impolitic of me to speak with such candor in the classroom. Okay, so who was Jesus? Don't know. Son of God? Nonsense. Resurrection of the body? Nonsense. Dualism? A problem. A huge problem. And as you can see, dualism is a problem in Christ. We are forced to admit, the believer is forced to admit that he was at once man and God. But no one can explain this. That he was both eternal spirit and temporal flesh. That he somehow partook of human... No one is ready to say that he sinned, but I've already told you how I at least think that he did sin. Yes, he sinned by his own standards, in his harshness toward the Scribes and Pharisees. I've already discussed that. Who he was is impossible to say. Who he thought he was, as presented in the Gospels, is even not very clear or defensible. The whole thing wrapped in mystery, if not obscurity, if not confusion. Clear thinking in these matters is impossible. If one tries to think clearly on these, one departs from the Gospels, that's for sure. Okay, I'm sorry, I've gone off on tangents here in talking about these matters. I left you with the Sermon on the Mount. We also get the Lord's Prayer, which is a noble utterance and immortalized. There it is in the Sermon on the Mount. This doctrine of the higher righteousness, which Matthew teaches to his Jewish Christians, this highest standards. Now, these standards, of course, had been adumbrated, good word, had been foreshadowed and suggested in certain parts of the Old Testament too. and the central doctrine of love thy neighbor, love God, and love thy neighbor as thyself, the golden rule and all that, central to Jesus' teaching, central to the Old Testament teaching too. Okay, Matthew. Matthew's main teaching in the long run, I'll get to this just as we close, and this is perfect timing, is what was the teaching? What was the kingdom? Jesus must have meant that the kingdom is this interim. There is the interim kingdom. The interim kingdom between his coming and the final coming is the time of the church. The church is the initiator of the kingdom. The church is the kingdom in its initial phases. What started the church? Jesus' coming. What will end history? The final coming. So Christianity, Matthew especially, Mark 2, Luke, has its apocalyptic view. Christian apocalyptic is somewhat different from the earlier Jewish apocalyptic. Matthew, understandably, may be more apocalyptic than the other two. Matthew is virtually a rabbi. Jesus will come. He will reward the good, punish the evil. No one understands these terms. Everyone who says punish the evil, reward the good, basically means himself. I'm convinced of that. Anyone who says, the Jews too, especially the Jews, because they meant we have suffered so much, and surely our reward awaits us. But everyone who says reward the good basically means himself, I believe. Maybe I'm too cynical on that, but I think, come Lord, punish the wicked, that means people I don't like, or Hitlers and things like that. Reward the good, that means me, and people, especially people who believe the same things as I do. Is this silly? Yes. Is it silly? Yes. But that's Matthew's kingdom, the church. Interim.